Welcome to the Diversity Talk series powered by the Great Companies, Great Leaders podcast and sponsored by Best Companies AZ and Career Connectors. I'm your host, Christine Gannon, and I am the founder and CEO of Brightworks Consulting. We are a boutique consulting firm focused on helping companies at the local level with DE&I solutions that really make a difference. And whether it's developing the entire strategy for DE&I or providing the latest best practices and policies, we offer a roadmap for companies to improve the culture. Today, we're honored to host the Diversity Talk series that was created to connect with award-winning companies who are committed to fostering a work environment where differences that we're born with and those we acquire throughout our lives are understood, valued, and celebrated. We're having conversations with Arizona's top employers to discuss how a focus on diversity and inclusion leads to better performance, increased innovation, and an enhanced ability to address customer needs and a more vibrant culture. Today, we are so honored to have with us Jaime Zepeda, is the Executive Vice President of Best Companies Group and Color Magazine, both parts of Bridge Tower Media. Jaime has more than a decade of experience in human resources and technology and supports the ongoing growth and expansion of Bridge Tower Media and Color Magazine. Prior to Bridge Tower, he served as Senior Vice President of Customer and People Success at Hive Diversity, which is a virtual recruiting platform that connects companies with employees of diverse backgrounds and experiences. Before that, he was part of LinkedIn's customer success team, helping to manage the company's relationships with large global enterprises. He began his career in HR tech at Great Place to Work, where he served in several leadership roles, including Vice President of Partnership Programs. He's based in the Bay Area, and he's active with several local organizations, including serving on the Board of Envisioneers and as a mentor and advisor to students rising above, Latinas in Tech, Bay Area Community Services, and bizworld.org. Jaime, welcome.
Thank you so much, Christine. Happy to be here.
So as we kick off our time together, I thought we would start by just chatting about, in your experience, how you have seen companies demonstrate their commitment to DE&I. We know there are a lot of best practices, but I have a feeling in your role, you've had an opportunity to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in my role, leading Best Companies Group and also Color Magazine, it comes up a lot because it comes up on the area of how do you engage your employees? How do you make sure that you create a workplace and a culture that makes them and allows them to thrive? And then how do you do that with a lens on lifting up underrepresented groups or professionals of color, or any diverse population that you might have within your organization? I'd say that one of the things that really communicates to top candidates, especially, that you are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're pretty basic things, but unfortunately, not a lot of organizations do that. I'm sure that you talk about it all the time with the companies you work with, but you need to have a plan, you need to have resources, and you need to have some level of progress, right? A plan meaning you are letting people know not just what you want to do, but how you're going to make it happen. Leadership is committed. They're explicit about these are the things that we're going to do, from pipeline to promotion, right? To create a more diverse workforce. You have the resources, meaning you have money, people, things assigned to that to make it happen. And then finally, you're able to do and demonstrate something that says, this is the progress that we're making so far. Metrics are important in that, some sort of KPIs, rather than it being, not so broad and vague. Is really saying, what are the things that you're focusing on for a period of time that tells you that we're making progress, so that if that doesn't happen, we can always pivot. I think those are things that are really important for every single company that's committed to this. Not everybody does that.
You are so spot on. Those three are so critical. And you're right, not everyone does that. A lot of times people want to maybe put in one or two things and check a box potentially because it's a lift, right? It can be intimidating in terms of the amount of work based on where the culture is at. But I love what you said about a plan, because an intentional strategy is really critical in terms of knowing where we're headed, right? And the assessment that often comes before that to determine where are you even at today, that lets you know how far do we have to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a baseline is incredibly important just for, what you just said right now is the idea of like creating a diverse workforce, an inclusive workforce, one where people feel like they can belong. I totally get it. It can be daunting, right?
Totally.
Even for the most seasoned HR professionals out there, like, how do I even grapple with that? If you're able to have some level of assessment at the very beginning of your journey that gives you a baseline of where you are right now, worst case scenario, it confirms what you already were believing, but at least you know what are the things that you can work on. Best case scenario, you realize we're not that far off from where we need to be, right? But
Right.
if you don't have that baseline, this big topic feels even bigger.
It does, absolutely. And the assessment also, I think, gives people somewhat of a roadmap because oftentimes people aren't sure where to start. To your point, it
Yeah,
can be daunting and it can feel overwhelming. And so either people don't start or they sort of start or they're not sure where to start. And so I think, the assessment does a couple different things to help people get moving and give them a roadmap, even if that roadmap is long term.
absolutely.
So we're going to stay on the topic of culture. And we know that we were just talking about this, building a culture really requires an intentional strategy. So what are some ways that you've seen organizations build their cultures specifically in terms of, what's in their plan? Like what types of activities?
Absolutely. Well, it really depends on where an organization is in their own journey of becoming a mature organization. Because obviously the plan can be very different for a startup than for, a multinational organization. In the same way that we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the same thing happens for culture is you need a plan, you need a vision, you need to figure out where you want to be, and then the resources, right, to get you there. One thing that I would share that has proven to be really helpful, regardless of where you are in your journey or what kind of company you are, and these are things that we talk to our clients at Best Companies Group about, is culture is not something that you're trying to build or create. It's not something that it says, okay, well, as of tomorrow, we're going to be this kind of company, right? That never works. Just like think of it in our own personal lives, like, oh, as tomorrow I'm going to be this person that goes to the gym every day and
Right.
meditates and all that. It's like, yeah, I mean, that might work for a little bit, but it won't stick. What we tell them is like, focus on your strengths, like focus on what you currently do really well and
Mhm.
amplify that as much as possible. One really great exercise that we tell a lot of companies to do is, like think back on the success stories that get talked about within your organization. Everybody has the lore, right? That we all say, like, remember that one
Right.
time we all huddled up and we did that, or so and so stepped up and went above and beyond in this way. Take a look at those things and then think like, why are they so special to us? What did they demonstrate? What values did they demonstrate? That's your culture, right? Now all
Right.
you got to do is get those things to happen more often, and that be the consistent thing that happens all the time. Because really, that culture is trust over time, is consistency
Absolutely.
over time, right? People can say, I know what kind of organization I'm stepping into tomorrow because I know how we do things. That's
Right.
when you build the culture.
The other way I would say when you talked about building strengths, is that an employee survey goes a long way to letting you know how are the employees feeling and what's important to them and what's their perception of what's happening in the organization and where there may be some blind spots to the
Yeah.
leadership team that they may not even know exist and that also can provide some insights in terms of where's our culture at and
Yeah.
what's happening maybe in spaces and places we don't know about that we need to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is especially true for organizations that are medium to large, because you'll
Yeah,
realize that you don't have just one culture, you have micro cultures, right?
that's so true.
Marketing has a culture, operation has a culture, research has a culture, accounting has a culture. And unless you do something to really take a look and pause and ask questions and launch a survey and then break that down by demographic groups, it can be like a big feeling like, whoa, how do we even tackle this? Who are we? What do we want to be? You might find out that, the sales team has a fantastic culture, and you might want to explore, how'd you get to that? What do you do in that function that we can explore and expand across the company? Again, rather than creating something from scratch, which of course is very daunting.
Right, absolutely. There are best practices. And you
Yeah.
really, when organizations think about this task of looking at DE&I or culture, there are best practices. There are companies that have figured this out that are doing awesome work. And so really, it doesn't have to be starting at zero. So we're gonna
Right.
stay on the topic of culture and talking about how we can create cultures that are inclusive. So when we think about creating an inclusive culture, if we pivot just a little bit and talk about an aspect of diversity specifically related to race and gender. When you think about that, what are some ways that you've seen that organizations have built, created organizations that feel inclusive for everyone, that feel like they've been intentional around this, whether it's recruiting women or retaining women of color or promotion or, those types of things. What have you seen?
Yeah, absolutely. There's two things. One is more on the HR program side. Another one is more of a leadership behavior that is really important. So on the HR program side, it's this, again, consistent celebration of diversity, where it doesn't feel like it's a box being checked, right? Like, oh, we hired more women, we hired more Latinos, et cetera. Great, let's just move on. It's actually like, okay, we hire them. How do we build them? How do we grow them? How do we connect them to the rest of the organization? How do we connect the rest of the organization to them? Right. And you do that by celebrating the diversity, celebrating the different perspectives, the different cultures, the different heritages that come up, and making that come up so often that it's just the norm. Right. Like it doesn't feel like, oh, we're just putting this on as like some sort of performance. But it's
Right.
like, no, we're committed to it. Like leaders talk about it. The CEO talks about it. There's a consistent programmatic aspect to it, right, from the HR side. And so, because then not only does that create the sense of everybody needs to create a diverse and inclusive workplace. It's not just HR, right?
Right.
We're all part of this.
Thank you. Thank you for
Right.
saying that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's one of the things that'll tell you that a culture or D&I strategy is going to fail is that only HR people are talking about it, right? Only HR people present on it and track like nobody else touches it. That's not going to go anywhere.
No.
It's going to have a great start and then just fall flat. So it's so you can see that it happens a lot, and then the celebration then also is something that for those people that you did bring into the organization that you wanted to bring in, they want to stay, right?
Yes.
They say, okay, it's not just something where I got pulled in and like, okay, go figure it out. It's like I'm being heard, I'm being a part of this team. That's huge. I've come from the tech world, right? I was in tech for some time, and one of the things that tech does great is attract top talent from underrepresented groups. One of the things that it does not do well is keep them,
Right.
right? It's like this great, like, let's pull them in, let's hire them. 2 years later, they're out the door. They've left because they realize this is not for me. I don't feel like I belong. I'm gonna
Right.
go somewhere else. That's a big problem in tech. The other thing that I wanted to mention is around more like how do we show up as leaders? Right? Because at the end of the day, our data shows that frontline managers are the most important people in creating a culture, right? The
Right.
CEO, the C-suite, incredibly important because they have to, sponsor it all the way.
Right.
But in terms of executing it, it's frontline managers. And one of the tips that I tell frontline managers, especially when you're trying to create this inclusive team, is you got to be quiet more often, right? You got to create this psychological safety in your team where anybody can share a thought, feedback, idea and feel heard, even if you're not going to move forward with the idea, but they feel like they can actually show up as themselves and say what's on their mind, obviously in a professional way,
Sure.
right? Without being said, oh, no, we don't do that here. Let's move on. Because that's especially triggering for someone that's in an underrepresented group. If you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're an LGBTQ, right? You naturally don't want to say anything because you're like, well, I don't know how much of myself I can show here.
Right.
And as soon as you say something, you get shot down. You're not going to talk again.
No.
Just be like, never mind. I tried. And so if you're a leader, if you're a frontline manager, you got to be extra careful about that. And just let them, share, be heard, create a psychological space that's safe, right? So people can feel like they can actually show up as themselves.
Creating that environment is intentional. It goes back to the beginning of our conversation in terms of a vision, right? And having a plan and a
Yeah,
strategy around what kind of an environment am I trying to create where it is inclusive and everyone does feel heard. And
right.
again, to your point, we can't implement every single thing that gets recommended, but that it's a safe place, to your point, that I can express and I can show up as myself. So I think that's super important.
Yeah.
You've done some amazing work at Bridge Tower Media and have a very strong foundation of DE&I. And you see organizations that have done this really well as well. So if I'm a company listening today and I'm motivated by what I'm hearing from you and I'm excited to start down the path, and maybe I've just been hesitant to do so, what kind of advice would you give someone?
I'd say start small, right? But start. Like just that's the hardest part is companies think like they have to solve all of this within a year. And that's just not going to work. Like I said, I've come from organizations, I've worked with organizations that are incredibly well funded, all the resources in the world, and it's still incredibly hard to get this right. Right. So it's more about starting and being consistent about what's going on. Like one example of starting small is take a look at how you hire people right now, how you interview people right now. Because one thing that any company out there can do, like this is not something that anybody can say, oh, we just don't have the funds or the resources or the time to do this. Any single company can do this, is standardize the questions that you ask your candidates. Every single candidate gets roughly the same kind of questions. Because I'm sure that you know this, but some people out there might not be listening that might not know this, is sometimes people ask different questions to different candidates because of who the candidate is, right? There's all these biases, right? Like, a similarity biases and all these things. But if you say, okay, for every single candidate, we always ask these questions so that when we talk about which candidate did we think did best, we all have sort of the same kind of data, right? That's a very simple step that any company out there can do and put together and start tomorrow. Like this is not a very hard thing. And I can assure you that if you do that and you stick with it for some time, you're going to see a very different kind of slate of candidates show up as the top candidates, right? And it's small and it's big. I mean, it can be big over time, but it's small and it can give you a lot of benefit down the line.
Absolutely. And related to that, some companies take the names off the applications
Right.
before they get to the hiring manager. So there's you, to your point, there are little things that you can do that do not cost a lot of money, but do have a big impact as it's consistent. It has to be consistent though, to your point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%.
So when we think about your company in closing, why do you recommend your company as a good place for a diverse candidate to apply?
That's great. Well, first of all, I'll say that we're a work in progress, right? So there are a lot of things that I'm sure we'll get better at over time that we're not doing well now. And I think that's, not to pat ourselves on the back, I think that's part of the reason why I'm confident that anybody who's a diverse candidate that wants to apply to either Best Companies Group, Bridge Tower Media, or Color Magazine, because we're all part of the same family, will thrive here because we do have that humility, right? To say, we don't have this figured out. We're not the best and we know everything, and just apply, you'll have a great time here. Right. We'll say like, yeah, we're getting better over time. We're hearing our employees. We're finding out, what do you think would make this a better place to work, right? I think that's a big part of it. So for anybody out there that's interested in joining our organization, or even if you're out there like thinking, what organization do I join? I encourage you to look at how humble they are about this whole journey, right? There's any company out there that tells you we got to figure it out, we're the best, and don't need to worry about that here, I'd be a little suspicious about that, right? But any company out there that shows you that they have humility around creating a great workplace, creating an inclusive workplace, they may not be there today, but I can assure you that they're on the right track.
Absolutely. One other thing I would add to that is sometimes sometimes companies do employee surveys, but then they don't do anything with the data.
Right.
And that's another element that, to your point, like you should be aware of, right? If you have employee surveys, that's an action that's happened, but what are you doing with that data? How are you using that data?
I tell some companies, when we're working with them initially, it's like, do you have a plan on what happens after the survey? Because if you don't, I almost encourage you to not do the survey.
Don't do it. No, it's damaging.
It is, because it creates, you can go from having a okay workplace where you're like, we still don't know what will make us great and what to work on, to a toxic workplace, simply by constantly asking people, well, what do you think we should do? What do you think we should do? What do you need? Oh, having that first step and then doing nothing about that later on, that tells people, you heard me and you did nothing. We heard crickets after this. I almost feel worse now, right? Because now I feel like I put my heart out there and I told you what I thought and it didn't matter. So that's why I tell you, like, you better have a plan afterwards. Otherwise, take some time. Maybe this is not the right time to do that. Maybe there's too many things going on. You need to have a post-survey plan on what happens.
One of the biggest eroders of trust, I think, right?
Yeah.
And the ability for people to feel that psychological safety.
Absolutely.
Sure. Okay, can I throw you a curveball, Jaime?
Yeah, sure.
Question.
Yeah.
Who's your hero?
Who's my hero? Oh my goodness. I would say my dad is my hero. Yeah, my dad. Well, my dad and my mom, for different reasons. They're both fantastic. And my dad is an entrepreneur. Still, he's 83 years old and he's still hustling.
That's awesome.
Yeah, he's still hustling. And so I admire him a lot, and my mom for the same reason. She's fantastic. And I look up to her and pretty much everything that I do now as a member of this family.
Awesome. Thanks for playing along. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for being with us today. Really great advice for organizations that are listening, no matter what level of maturity that they're at on this journey of DE&I.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Christine.
Brightworks Consulting hosts this podcast and YouTube channel to spotlight the leadership around the world that is changing lives. Brightworks offers a myriad of consulting services in the public and private sector, to include diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions for any size company. You can find us at www.brightworksconsulting.com. We're honored to have Best Companies AZ as a presenting sponsor for this podcast. Best Companies AZ is your #1 source for regional employer branding. You can find them at www.bestcompaniesaz.com.